Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Ron Patel, and I'll be hosting this webinar as it's delivered through the Climate Resilience Capacity Building Program. I'm joined by my colleague Andrea, as well as some guests for today, and you'll get to hear from each of them a little later on. I see that there are folks still petering in on the other end of the stream, but I'll just start with a little bit of housekeeping before we get formally going. So again, thanks for joining us today. We'll be talking today mainly about climate resiliency in rural communities, and we'll be looking at a specific example from the summer village of Ghost Lake. For those that are joining with us live today, you are joining us through a stream of the webinar. So as a stream attendee, you're on the other end, which means you don't have a mic or a camera, but if you do have questions, you can put it into the question and answer box, which you should be able to locate likely on the sidebar of your screen. So feel free to use the question and answer box throughout the webinar, but we'll take questions at the end. We are also recording today's stream, so if you would like to refer back to anything that is mentioned, you will have access to a recording link down the line. And I'll move us along in the presentation. So I would like to start by respectfully acknowledging that we live, work, and play on the traditional and ancestral territories of many Indigenous, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. While we recognize that we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples. Today, I'm presenting virtually from the city of Edmonton. The lands on which Edmonton sits and the river that run through it have been the site of natural abundance, ceremony and culture, travel and rest, relationship building, making, and trading for Indigenous people since time immemorial. Edmonton is located on Treaty 6 territory, and we'd like to acknowledge the many Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. We make this acknowledgement as a small act of reconciliation, gratitude, and commitment in pursuing an inclusive, collaborative, and respectful path forward in building strong communities. For those of us that are joining today and are not familiar with the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre, we were established in 2009 as a collaborative initiative between three partners. That's Alberta municipalities, the rural municipalities of Alberta, as well as the government of Alberta. And the Action Centre provides funding, technical assistance, and education to Alberta communities, nonprofits, and schools in addressing climate change. Here on this slide, you can see 12 different 12 years of impacts from a range of climate mitigation and resiliency programs. We're proud to have supported 721 projects in local groups, whether that be governments, Indigenous communities, school authorities, or other community-related organizations. We're really glad to see that outreach. You can see some other stats here as well. But I'll also point out that we have a long list of project examples, specific work that has been done in a variety of communities found on our website at mccac.ca. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic and the video over to Andrea Miller, who is a project assistant with our team supporting the Climate Resilient Capacity Building Program. Slide, and we'll just with the video. Over to you, Andrea.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrea Miller. Thanks so much for joining us. So I'm a project assistant with the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre. I'll start today by just going over the agenda for today's webinar. So we'll begin with an overview of some climate resilience concepts. We'll start with what climate impacts mean in the context of local governments and how those impacts are understood as climate risks. We'll move to how local governments are responding to climate risks through adaptation. And next, we'll talk about resilience and focus specifically on the unique features of small municipalities that both strengthen and constrain their resilience and their ability to adapt to climate change. And then I'll introduce our guests from the Summer Village of Ghost Lake and Morrison Hirschfield, and we'll hear about the newly completed Summer Village of Ghost Lake Climate Resilience and Adaptation Plan. And then I'll turn it back over to Ronick from our team, and we'll hear more about the Climate Resilience Capacity Building Program. And we'll end with a Q&A with our guests. So I encourage you to think of some questions for them throughout the presentation today. So we know that climate change is amplifying the frequency and the intensity of extreme weather events. Communities of all types and all sizes will experience further climate change. Large urban centers, small rural municipalities, Indigenous communities will all uniquely experience climate impacts. And each community has a unique set of strengths and challenges when it comes to responding to these impacts. So as the focus of the webinar today, municipalities are on the forefront of the changing climate and are increasingly vulnerable to climate impact. We know that extreme weather has intersecting and cumulative impacts not only on municipal assets and services, but also community-wide impacts on private property, the economy, environment, and health and well-being of residents. 60% of public infrastructure falls under municipal jurisdiction, and 1/3 of that infrastructure is considered to be in fair to very poor condition. Municipalities are also where the majority of the population lives and works. So climate risk is the intersection of the likelihood of these climate impacts occurring and the consequences of these impacts. A high-risk item is a climate impact that has an almost certain likelihood of occurring with high or extreme consequences. This degree of risk is the foundation for a community establishing priorities and taking action through adaptation. So there are several ways that municipalities are responding to climate risks, and we'll hear about one approach today, which involved assessing risks and identifying actions in a climate resilience and adaptation plan. So adaptation involves strategic actions to reduce a community's vulnerability to the negative impacts of climate change, while also taking advantage of potential new opportunities. Adaptation is not actions which aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which are categorized as mitigation. Adaptation can be reactive in response to climate impacts or anticipatory, taking action before the impacts of climate change are observed. So local governments have a significant role in climate adaptation for a number of reasons. Each region will experience climate impacts differently, and each community is different in terms of their geography, their institutions. And so local governments have an opportunity to tailor adaptation actions to their local circumstances and to the unique set of climate impacts that they'll experience. Aligning climate adaptation more closely with the local context enables decision makers to better integrate local knowledge and engage community members in adaptation planning, and can contribute to greater buy-in from residents and leaders in the long term. Adaptation may be more feasible financially and logistically at the local level, and potentially more impactful. Local governments also have access to unique mechanisms that can drive climate adaptation, such as land use planning. And in many cases, municipal decision makers are already engaging in risk management and are already familiar with responding and adapting to changes. So the capacity of local governments to adapt is a function of the resilience of their institutions and natural systems. So resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society to absorb, adapt to, and recover from hazards without undergoing fundamental changes to its functional characteristics. It's the measure of a system to absorb changes and still persist. So what that means for municipalities is that a resilient community is one that has developed the capacity to absorb future shocks to its systems, its infrastructure, and is still able to maintain those same functions as well as its identity. This means continuing to provide essential services and ensuring the health and well-being of residents. Resilience is the ability to increase capacity for learning and adaptation. So the greater the resilience, the greater a system's ability to absorb shocks and adapt to change. Conversely, the less resilient the system, the greater its vulnerability and the less able to adapt to change. So small municipalities in particular experience a unique set of constraints on the resilience and their capacity for climate change adaptation. Small municipalities may have fewer financial resources and limited access to capital to fund climate adaptation. They may have smaller teams with fewer staff to dedicate to climate adaptation planning, implementation, and monitoring. They may lack internal expertise, requiring them to outsource to external specialists. And many of the challenges facing small rural communities more generally are also constraints on their resilience and their capacity to adapt to climate change, including urbanization, aging populations, and loss of industry employers. So that being said, small communities also have a unique set of strengths that can contribute to their resilience. Local climate champions and community organizations in small communities can have a significant role in increasing awareness and mobilizing support. Local governments in small communities can have more influence with community organizations, businesses, and residents. There may be well-established relationships between municipal departments and community stakeholders, creating new opportunities for communication and collaboration. And municipal teams may be smaller and more unified, making decision-making more streamlined. Climate adaptation can also be aligned with existing goals and ongoing work around rural community revitalization and sustainability, and this can lead to a number of health, economic, and social co-benefits. So today, we're very fortunate to hear some insights on climate resilience in small communities from members of the project team for the Summer Village of Ghost Lake Climate Resilience and Adaptation Plan. Mustafa Hashimi is the Chief Administrative Officer for the Summer Village of Ghost Lake. As CAO, Mustafa manages day-to-day operations for the municipality, as well as long-term planning. Clarissa Huffman is a climate change planner and project manager with Morrison Hirschfield. She specializes in climate-informed community planning and brings a wealth of experience with low-carbon resilience, nature-based solutions, and developing climate risk and vulnerability assessments for local governments. So thank you for joining us. I think actually we're just joined by Claire today, if I'm not mistaken. So if
yeah, Andrea, I'm going to pass it over to Claire. I think we might have a tech problem with Mustafa, but Claire's going to do her best to try and cover that portion, but we'll move ahead.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us, Claire. I will pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrea, Ronak. It's great to be here with all of you and to share some of the learnings from our project with the Summer Village of Ghost Lake. It's too bad that we're having trouble hearing from Mustafa because I was really looking forward to his contributions to this program, but I'm hoping that I can do it justice on his behalf, and hopefully he'll be able to join us later. So to get started, the Summer Village of Ghost Lake is a small rural summer village to the west of Calgary. They have a permanent population of 82 people as of the 2016 census, so a very small community. What this number doesn't include is things like seasonal residents, young children that maybe are transitioning between households, long-term visitors, and things like this. So the reality is that the population on the ground may be a little bit more than that 82 people that is officially captured by the 2016 census. But the really important thing here to recognize is just the challenges that come with taking on a project like this for a very small community. And so that's a trend that we're going to see throughout, is how we deal with that. So the Summer Village of Ghost Lake really is founded in community. The community prioritizes open communication, active participation, local governance, but also the ability to live within their own means as a small community and to be able to match the services that they're able to provide and the types of projects that they're able to implement with the reality of the financial staff and volunteer resources that are available at any one given time. So safety, recreation, community facilities, social activities, these are all the types of things that often get prioritized for servicing within the municipality. Of course, being on the Ghost Lake Reservoir, a key priority is the active protection and the minimization of impacts on the lake and the natural environment. And so how that typically translates to municipal development is realistically that the community is looking to maintain that quiet, low density type development. And so that really, I hope, sets you up to understand the context in which we were approaching this project. Some of the values that the community holds include things like respect for each other and for the environment, environmental stewardship, safety, again, that village way of life, they call it their haven on the lake, and again, that opportunity for shared responsibility and accountability within the community. So with that, maybe we will go to the next slide. And oh, I think we might have gone one too far. Yeah, we'll just stay here for a minute. Thank you. So on this one here, when we start to talk about development constraints, one of obviously the main things is that Ghost Lake Reservoir and the Trans-Alta lease area along the south side of the community, but we also have some significant steep slopes heading up to the Highway 1A, as well as some important natural features along the, particularly in the southwest, but not exclusively. So things like wetlands, groundwater fed springs, and some pretty important, fairly undisturbed naturalized areas. Maybe now we will move on to talk about the actual vision of the plan. So again, jumping back to that idea of the community's acknowledgement that they really see themselves as having a role to play in contributing to the resilience of all Canadian communities. And so a lot of the conversations for this plan was centered around this idea of how can we contribute within our own sphere of influence, and what does that mean as a small rural community with very limited resources. So the Summer Village of Ghost Lake ultimately values their own self-sufficiency and values that citizen action. And so this plan was really intended to achieve that balance between governance and community approaches. And we really prioritized this idea of multi-solving solutions, this idea of what can we do to maximize efficiency, to achieve multiple objectives with one integrated solution, as well as actions with co-benefits. So looking for things that maybe if we do this one thing, there will be these trickle-on effects in other places that are important to us. And so these two kind of categories of actions, multi-solving solutions and co-benefits, were really important in this project to help us overcome these capacity and resourcing challenges that come with being a small rural municipality. So the vision for the plan, as shown on the screen, was reviewed by the Summer Village of Ghost Lake Council prior to inclusion in the plan. And that was that the Summer Village of Ghost Lake will build capacity within its means wherever possible to ensure that our community and its residents remain safe, resilient, responsive, and self-sufficient in the face of a changing climate for generations to come. So next slide, please. Based on these community values and priorities that I've started to articulate here for you today, within the project, we ultimately identified 4 pillars that helped us to prioritize and kind of collect our thoughts around the different types of adaptation actions that we might have been able to include in the plan. I will explain this process in a little bit more detail, but for now, I just want to share with you at a high level these 4 pillars. So first, we have the municipal buildings and services. So thinking about those core municipal services that even in a small rural village, you still have the expectation of safe and reliable servicing. So thinking about things like roads, collaborating on fire prevention and response, managing waste, and the municipal development planning process, and so on. This is important due to the interconnection between the Summer Village of Ghost Lake as a community and other nearby communities, as well as providing those core services to residents. Parks, recreation, and green space fundamentally, of course, is around protecting and conserving those natural spaces, which we've already identified as a key priority. Not only the reservoir, but some of those other key natural spaces that I identified, as well as parks and recreational areas, given that the village really identifies as an outdoor community. Number 3 being water. This was repeatedly identified as an area of concern, in particular, concerns about long-term access to clean and reliable drinking water. So we will discuss this in a little bit more detail in particular, but this was a really interesting pillar because there was a lot of community concern about availability and quality of water moving into the future. But you'll see, or we will discuss, that the risk assessment for this particular interaction actually came through as comparatively low, and that the Summer Village's water supply, both in terms of their groundwater, their proximity to groundwater aquifers, as well as their proximity to the Ghost Lake Reservoir, actually this system was quite resilient to climate-related impacts. And so how do we kind of navigate that? And finally, homes and people. So human health and safety, of course, is of critical importance. And this pillar also recognizes that the community's primary land use is residential. And so prioritizing not only people's homes, but the safety of the people themselves and kind of the interactions there that exist between homes and people. Next slide, please. So here on the screen here, you see generally the 4 steps of our climate resilience planning process. Step 1 requires us to define the scope, the work plan, and the objectives. So we did this during the early phases of the project in collaboration with Summer Village of Ghost Lake project representatives. We learned that hazards of particular concern included things like extreme heat, drought events, and indirect wildfire interface. So these community concerns helped us to ensure that we were able to scope the risk assessment appropriately. Step 2 of the resilience planning process is where we started to cross-reference each of those climate hazards with each of the community elements as defined in step 1 to determine whether or not there's a potential exposure, and then to assign a consequence score. So the project team completed this step in workshop format where various risk assessment and subject matter experts on our team worked through each potential interaction to assign exposure and consequence scores. We then had an open session with the community where we worked through the results of that process and just had an opportunity to kind of ground truth it and ask members of the representatives for the community if those scores made sense based on the lived experience. And so step 3 is where we started to create recommendations for risk treatment options and adaptation actions for consideration by the community. So these actions, again, kind of circling back to that idea of self-sufficiency and resource efficiency, these actions were really intended to be as practical and as implementable as possible, so that the Summer Village of Ghost Lake can take action to respond to the high and extreme risk elements, but really narrowing in on those items that are within their own sphere of influence. And so finally, step 4 is where the village is able to take the results of this plan and use it as a foundation to begin the process of implementing the actions in the plan to support the community's resilience to a changing climate. And we will get in a little bit more detail as to what we've been working on in terms of implementation, because we did aim to hit the ground running, and the Summer Village of Ghost Lake is an excellent example in that regard. Next slide, please. So at a high level, the results of the risk assessment process are shown here. So we ended up assessing 234 interactions. That was 18 community valued elements, cross-referenced with 13 hazards that were identified as specifically relevant to the Summer Village of Ghost Lake in terms of what the climate was projected to look like into the future. And through this process, we identified that there are a number of potential risks as shown here on the screen. So high and extreme risks items were moved forward in that process, meaning that the project team recommended risk treatment and adaptation actions for these risks to help the village prioritize the actions that will have the most impact when considering how to increase community resilience. Moderate and low risk items don't require any further action at this time, but it is worthwhile to revisit that risk assessment periodically as an important part of plan monitoring and evaluation to ensure that risk scores are still accurate over time. There is the possibility that as data and as projections improve, or as the village's situation changes, that risk scores may change. And sometimes something that is moderate may elevate to a high risk, meaning that we might want to consider whether action is required at that time. Next slide, please. So I won't spend too much time here, but this summary of results captures the fact that high and extreme risks are increasing over time, with a corresponding decrease in some of those low to moderate risks. Some of the negligible risks are also increasing, which is mostly due to factors like reduced likelihood of extreme and cold snow events and the associated potential consequences there. So some of the high and extreme risk interactions for the village under projected future climate conditions were resulting from things like extreme heat, from indirect wildfire, from wind and combination events, invasive species, precipitation, riverine flooding, and drought. Next slide, please. Here we will just discuss a couple of quick examples of what some of those high and extreme risks ended up being. So you can see a couple examples on your screen here, but thinking through a few of them. We'll start with impacts of extreme heat on the community hall. So some of the things we were thinking about were things like the financial impacts of needing extra air conditioning, or the associated energy impacts of that extra cooling, or functional impacts on the building, such as whether energy systems and building mechanical systems are actually able to handle those increased electrical demands. And of course, human health and safety if the building is not able to be kept at an adequately cool temperature. In terms of impacts of indirect wildfire elements on residents, we were thinking about the continuity of the use of spaces, for example, not being able to open windows or not being able to access outdoor recreation, which we know is very important to this community, as well as some of the compounding impacts with extreme heat. So if you have extreme heat and a wildfire smoke event at the same time, there's the potential for those impacts to interact with each other. And then, of course, the health impacts of poor air quality. In terms of impacts of invasive species on native grasslands is the final example that I'd like to share with you. But what we were thinking about here is shifts in temperature, precipitation, and season length. So as those kind of shifts occur gradually over time, as well as human introduction of new species, we could see a shift in the species composition in the region. And these species could potentially be highly invasive and could potentially be pests to native grasslands, or become competitive plant species, which can be problematic from a biodiversity perspective, amongst other things. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do now is just quickly walk through the 4 guiding principles for each of the 4 pillars. I'm not going to get too deep into the actions in each principle, because in the interest of time, I'd like to save some time for discussion rather than working through those actions, but happy to chat more after the fact if it's necessary. So for municipal buildings and services, really what we were interested in is making sure that as infrastructure is upgraded over time, we're using climate-informed data and decision-making processes to make sure that we're able to provide that continuity of service delivery at the levels expected by residents, even in the face of potentially very different climate change scenarios. The next one is parks, green space, and recreation. So here we really are leveraging that idea of community and relying on the community to work together to both protect and conserve their recreational and natural green spaces. Again, thinking back to not only their value to people, but also their value intrinsically, which is really important and can help us to leverage nature-based solutions to enhance community resilience. Next is homes and people. So here again, thinking about the residential uses being a predominant use in the community, looking at the interactions between homes and people and climate change impacts. Really here, what we wanted to focus on was making sure that residents have the tools and the information they need to make climate-informed decisions and enhance the resilience of their homes, their properties, and make sure that they are able to safely respond in the event of a climate-related emergency or a natural hazard more generally. And finally, we will speak about water. So here again, we spoke about how this was an important community concern. And so really ultimately here, what we wanted to do is make sure that residents, community members, and visitors have a source of safe and reliable drinking water, and that we are taking steps to protect both surface and groundwater sources due to their importance, both as natural systems, as recreational opportunities in the case of the reservoir, and in terms of their value as potable water sources. What I'd like to do now on the next slide is chat with you quickly about how we prioritized actions. So on the screen here, you can see some of the types of actions that we considered when developing our recommendations. So things like structural, like replacing, refurbishing existing structures or building new ones. So protecting, managing, and restoring natural systems and looking to nature-based solutions. Community tools like engagement, education, programming, thinking about ways we can incentivize or disincentivize various behaviors, and probably very importantly, partnerships and collaborations for a very small community. That's particularly important. Risk transfer and acceptance, so thinking about ways where we can acknowledge the risks that we could potentially be exposed to and how we might be able to best prepare to accept those risks or transfer them elsewhere. And finally, further study, so looking at what else do we need more information, and how can we go about getting that information to feel confident in our recommendations. So given the limited budget for capital investments, a lot of our actions focused on the rightmost four columns rather than the structural. We really looked at how can we leverage nature-based solutions? How can we leverage partnerships? How can we potentially strengthen our bylaw and policy systems and our emergency response systems to better be prepared for some of these potential exposures to increased risk? And what are some of the opportunities where we could potentially gather more information and conduct more detailed assessments to feel really confident in our approach? Next slide, please. Through this process, we learned a lot about what this process actually means for small rural communities with very limited resources as compared to larger municipalities with larger budgets and more staff. And so I'm hopeful that this can inspire other smaller communities to consider how they can contribute to a regional or national climate response in their own way. So you see 4 key lessons learned here. The first one being that idea of sphere of influence. So many services, especially for small communities, are shared or regional services. And so it was important to understand what leverage points exist for the summer village of Ghost Lake versus where it makes sense to collaborate, partner, or advocate for change at various levels. Having solutions that were practical, implementable, and affordable was really important for the community. So there was some discomfort during this process around what it would mean to have more than 50 high and extreme risks for such a small community. And there was this clear sentiment that we didn't want to have a plan that the community couldn't do anything with because they didn't have the resources. So this was an exercise in acting under uncertainty and being willing to course correct, but also being like really, really, really practical and really transparent about what we can achieve and how can we walk that line of balancing being really bold and forward thinking while being a bit realistic about what we can actually achieve with a very small pot of resources that are available to us. Next is community participation. So there was a bit of a challenge around the limited capacity and availability of residents to be able to participate. So with only around 80 permanent residents, combined with the typical challenges of engagement in rural small town environments, we had to be very pragmatic about how to connect with people, especially considering the limited capacity of the staff who do their work part-time around other full-time positions. So balancing all these factors, we chose a fairly informal engagement process where we shared out on major project milestones via the village's website, where most people tend to go to get their information. And all communications included contact information so they could reach out to us at any time and provide feedback or ask questions. The key engagement opportunity was a digital workshop in which people could log in and participate in an action development and prioritization exercise. So there was that really important touch point. The last one is this idea of reducing duplication, which kind of ties into the above about community engagement to some extent. So this community is fairly stable in terms of their residential population, not a lot of change in terms of population size or changes in residency. Thus, the detailed consultation and action prioritization that occurred a couple of years ago during the municipal development plan update and then subsequently the sustainability plan was determined to be still highly relevant. So we chose in this case to kind of really leverage that and try to minimize duplication by relying on that great engagement that already took place and look for ways that we could build efficiency into the plan by building on those existing actions wherever possible using a climate lens. So the result of all of this was a very small suite of 20 targeted actions that are in our collective perspectives likely to have a high impact on the community's resilience and that the community felt empowered to take steps to achieve. In terms of next steps on the next slide, again, I just want to highlight that groundwater and drought risk came out as significantly socially important during project scope and conversations for the Summer Village of Ghost Lake Climate Resilience and Adaptation Plan. This importance was reaffirmed in existing planning documents and based on staff and resident concerns. However, as I mentioned, the groundwater risk emerged as comparatively low in terms of technical risk during the climate risk assessment. So to address the importance of groundwater to the community and the potential kind of misalignment that we're seeing here in terms of risk interpretation, the Summer Village of Ghost Lake decided that their first task in the implementation phase of their climate adaptation plan was to conduct a climate resilient groundwater assessment and to develop an implementation plan, which would be a more detailed community-oriented analysis to explore the relationship between climate change and groundwater within the village. And the goal here was to really ensure that residents have access to safe and reliable drinking water in the context of climate change. This project, which has just recently kicked off, is a great example of how communities can bridge from Stream 1 planning to Stream 2 strategies and initiatives with the MCCAC funding. And Morrison Hirschfield is very excited to continue to support the village on their climate resilience journey in this way. So with that, my email is going to pop up on the screen here for a few seconds and feel free to jot it down. And I'd be happy to chat with anybody about this project or any other questions you might have about a similar project or just questions more generally. I'm always happy to have those conversations. But with that, I'm going to pass it back over to my colleagues to take on the next portion of this session.
Awesome. Thank you, Claire. Appreciate your ability to fill in for this presentation as both the community as well as the climate resiliency expert. So as Claire mentioned, we have about 20 minutes left. We'll do the question and answer period in the last 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to move ahead and give an overview of how the program is intended to work. I see some questions coming in, so here's a great chance for you to think about questions that you might have for Claire and pop those in while I do the program overview. So yeah, just a couple of slides here on how the Climate Resiliency Capacity Building Program is intended to work. The program itself is designed to help Alberta municipalities as well as Indigenous communities in Alberta better understand, cope, manage, and adjust to the changing climate conditions that we're facing. So we're looking specifically to help the communities in broadening their climate resiliency literacy, assessing climate vulnerabilities, building climate resilient plans, as well as making progress on risk reduction strategies. Claire hinted at this, but the program is structured in 3 funding streams. Each funding stream has its own specific objective and participation criteria. The planning stream, as you can likely guess, provides funding for the assessment of climate risks and vulnerabilities, as well as the creation of climate resilient plans. So this project that we just looked at with Ghost Lake was funded under this stream. The second stream, Strategies Initiative stream, is for communities that already have plans and have specific action items that need to be advanced in preparation for implementation. So if there's research or feasibility assessments or something in that space to advance an action on climate resiliency and adaptation in an existing plan, this is what that stream is for. And this is what Ghost Lake has most recently been approved for with the water project that Claire referenced. In the Indigenous Climate Resilience stream, we provide funding specifically to Indigenous communities in Alberta for projects that increase community capacity on climate resiliency. And here we recognize that there is a unique need, unique impact, and unique perspective of Indigenous peoples, and that includes the use of Indigenous and or traditional ecological knowledge. So there's room in this stream for projects that fit better with that lens. The following communities are eligible to participate in the capacity building program. So we have 4 definitions for municipalities within the province of Alberta under the Municipal Government Act. In the program, we try to apply 8 definitions for Indigenous communities. This includes Treaty First Nations, Métis settlements, as well as any self-governing or non-status nation or community. We also look to approve projects from governance or cultural organizations that represent an affiliation of Indigenous communities. That could include tribal councils, regional councils, confederacies, treaty organizations, as well as the Métis Settlement General Council and Métis Nation of Alberta. We're open to community partnerships, so there might be another way that perhaps isn't defined here as well either. I'll just flag that all community types can apply for funding in the planning stream and strategies initiative stream, but only Indigenous communities can apply for the Indigenous climate resilience stream. The Action Center will provide funding that covers up to 100% of pre-GST capacity building services to a maximum funding cap of $80,000 per project per community. So all project types and all 3 streams are subject to the same maximum funding cap. As I mentioned, for partnership projects, where we're working with preset cultural governance partnerships or perhaps new regional or organizational partnerships, these projects that involve more than one community would be subject to a maximum funding cap of $160,000 per project. And then the last number that you see on the screen here is the cap for any one single community. So this is to help ensure that there's broad participation by a large number of Alberta communities. The total program funding that's distributed to a single community is capped at $160,000 per across all streams. Eligible costs can include the services of a qualified third-party contractor. So if you're bringing in some expertise, like this example we're looking at from Ghost Lake, that's an eligible use of grant proceeds. Grant proceeds can also be used for costs that are a bit more internal or related to the development of internal capacity. If you're doing things like knowledge transfer, workshops, training, wage subsidies, honorarium, those types of costs would be eligible as long as they're attached to the overall project deliverable. And then I'll just reiterate that the approval and allocation of eligible funds does occur on a first come, first served basis. And I'll actually give a little bit of an update on the program itself here in the next slide. But yeah, if you are curious to apply for funding, there's a couple of steps that I would suggest you walk through. Step 1 is to review the program materials. So we have a program guidebook online that details everything on how the program works. We're also available to answer any questions, so feel free to send us an email or set up a meeting to talk about your project. If you do have an idea of what you would like to look at, you can move along to step 2, which is submitting an expression of interest. So eligible communities must submit an online EOI or expression of interest that just shares high level about the project. So I'll ask you about sort of the problems that you're facing and how the program is anticipated to help you overcome those challenges. What's your current level of capacity and what specific stream are you interested in? We'll follow up on your EOI submission to discuss eligibility, talk about the project details, answer questions, and help prepare you for the formal application stage. So step 3 is where you would actually submit an application. So if you're eligible, you would complete the application and it basically asks you for project details, including a full work plan for the work involved. You're encouraged to discuss your application with our team ahead of finalizing the submission. But I guess the big thing I wanted to stress here was just timelines. So applications will be received, reviewed, and approved until March 31st of this year. So that's coming up at the end of next month. Or if all funding is allocated, whichever occurs first. So we're currently in a position where this program has received more applications than funding that remains available. So what this means is that applications will continue to be reviewed and prepped for approval, but approval will only happen if there's a confirmation of funding being available. This will likely slow down the process for those that are currently working on applications or have applications in. If you're maybe seeing this for the first time and are interested in submitting an EOI, I would still encourage you to do so and get yourself into the application queue. But just recognize that there's a chance or perhaps a risk that your application won't be approved as the program reaches full subscription. If your project is approved, you would receive that confirmation from us, and we would move along to the next step. Pending a successful application approval, we would issue a funding agreement. The funding agreement outlines sort of the legal aspects of the grant proceeds and includes all project work, including all of the things that were outlined in the application. We'll also detail all of the project completion documents and agree upon what needs to be submitted at the end of the project within the project timeline that's outlined in the funding agreements. Another note here, I'll stress that it's only once the funding agreement is executed by both the community and on our end is when funding is considered allocated and reserved in the queue. Regarding the payment schedule, this program does have a 2-payment schedule. So the bulk of the grant proceeds are released to the community when funding agreement is signed. So you'll get 75% of grant proceeds up front. Then you do step 6, which is completion of your project. So you start out and work on your project, and at the end, you submit the material that was previously agreed upon back into us. The agreed upon material is again outlined in the application form as well as a funding agreement. Deadline here is that all projects must be completed on or before March 31st of 2024. So that's next year, 13, 14 months from now. Pending the verification of your project completion, we will then release the remaining balance of the funds. So that remaining 25% will get paid out to you at the end of your project. And then I'll just sort of share that although the bulk of the program is intended to provide funding support, we also do provide some additional supports that are focused on capacity building beyond the context of funding. We do run, this should say, the Community Climate Resiliency Express Planning Guide. So this is sort of a do-it-yourself kind of guideline on how to do this work in a community at a kind of high level. If you're interested in other education opportunities, we also do plan to host more webinars like this one, or you can go look at our back catalog of webinars already completed. We also do share a library of resources online on our Learning Center. We publish our own resources. Andrea just recently completed the Indigenous Climate Resilience Resource Hub, and you can find that up on the Learning Center. We also share resources from other organizations as well, so you can find links in that space. We also host a community of practice. So this is for municipalities as well as Indigenous communities that are working on climate resiliency, just a shared space to discuss progress, ideas, challenges, really allow that peer-to-peer learning in this space. And then we also do post-project showcases for anyone in the program. If they complete their project, we'll post some details up on our website as well. So you can read more about this Ghost Lake project as well as future CRCB program completions as they kind of get close to the deadline there. Okay, so I think at this point, we're ready to move along to the question section with about 10 minutes left. I see a couple questions in the queue. Why don't we jump straight into those, if that sounds good? And Claire, I'm guessing most of these are going to be for you, but let's take a look at them in order. Okay, so the first question, Claire, is I guess, thanking you for a great workshop on how to go about determining climate resiliency priorities. But this person is asking if you can tell us about some of the details, I guess, that Ghost Lake came up with. Maybe the number of actions in the work plan, or is there, is there stuff in the plan that helps them beyond just like a list of, what they should do? I think some room for you to answer that how you would like.
Sure, definitely. Thanks, Renak. I can speak to that. So as I mentioned in the presentation itself, we ended up landing on a series of 20 very targeted actions spread across those 4 pillars. And so what we were looking at while we were developing that work plan is making sure that we had something in that plan that was intended to address each of those 50 high and extreme risks. But based on our approach to prioritize multi-solving solutions and co-benefits, we ended up in most cases where one of those actions by nature was responding to anywhere from 2 to 6 of the different high and extreme risks. So what we did was we looked at cost, complexity, and combined priority. So what I mean by combined priority is funneling in and aggregating our project teams' expected priority levels for these various actions, as well as the community's priority levels for these various actions in that digital workshop. And so what we ended up with was having a list of those 20 actions organized by pillar and by priority. So some of the high priority actions that ended up making it into the plan were things like developing for the village a climate-related set of safety policies and procedures for staff to help protect human health and safety, and identify procedures for safely continuing or resuming service delivery. We looked at collaborating on developing and reviewing a firefighting response plan, including access to water, both when the lake is at normal and at low levels. In terms of homes and buildings, we included an action item to develop an emergency management plan in coordination with neighboring communities and develop associated community engagement programs to ensure that all residents understand how to remain safe during extreme events, including for both essential and recreational activities. In terms of parks and green space, we included an action here to develop and implement a fire smart climate resilient landscaping program for parks and recreational areas, including actions such as planting drought tolerant grass and plant species, installing wood chips around large vegetation to support moisture retention, planting species as windbreaks, large canopies for shade, and so on and so forth. And finally, in the water category, our highest priority action was conducting that detailed groundwater assessment to assess the likelihood and consequence of climate impacts on well water quality and quantity, and to explore the feasibility of more specific adaptation actions where appropriate, to really dive into the details of exploring that very important community priority. So this plan is currently publicly available on the Summer Village of Ghost Lake website, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in diving into a little bit more of the details of those action items to check it out on there.
Yeah, that's great. We also linked to the plan in project showcase. So hopefully there's a couple links that you can find to look at the actual plan and kind of scroll through. It's definitely a long document, so I can appreciate that we weren't able to speak to everything in today's webinar, but great answer. Claire, I think this next one probably is best answered by you as well. How important is it for every small community to have their own risk assessments, or perhaps is there a benefit in pooling risk assessments and recommendations in a larger region?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that. I would say that in this case, one of the reasons that we went with a standalone risk assessment and adaptation plan was really kind of centered around that value that the community holds around self-sufficiency and kind of community action. However, I think there's a lot of space for regional collaboration and looking at how various municipalities, First Nations, and neighboring communities could come together to look at their collective risks and the ways they could collectively act on those risks in terms of adaptation actions, because certainly climate change is not bound by municipal boundaries, and there's a lot of value in those types of collaborations and partnerships. And in fact, Ronak, maybe you can speak to this, but if I'm not mistaken, under this funding program, neighboring communities can collaborate and submit a paired funding agreement or a paired funding application in order to do exactly that.
Yeah, exactly that. We recognize that doing this work can be a bit more effective if you work at a bigger scale. Again, mirroring what Claire said. At the same time, I think there's an equity lens, or perhaps even just like a workflow lens. Often it's hard to work regionally, so we don't try to kind of push any of those projects. But I think it's a great use of regional partnerships where folks have them to do this work across boundaries.
Definitely.
Great. I'm trying to answer some questions just in the chat as well, so hopefully that works for some of the folks. Kind of clear some space for Clarissa. Maybe we'll take one more question, just considering the time that we have left. So question for Clarissa. Thank you for the presentation. It looks like a great project, especially impressive for such a small community. I guess this kind of ties to our last question, but this person is wondering for the partnership and collaboration components. Is there any current collaboration and or information exchange with surrounding communities? Seems like there are some specifically Indigenous communities, 3 Stoney Nations in the area, as well as recognizing that Ghost Lake is in traditional Stoney Dakota territory. Is any of this information sort of as a function of it being completed benefiting the neighbors or the area that it's in beyond kind of Ghost Lake?
Yeah, thanks for that. Great question. I would say that to start with, I should say that based on the fact that the village is such a small community, that maintaining information flows has certainly been a challenge, and that's just my experience and what I've witnessed in supporting the community through this project. And so certainly one of the things that we've been thinking about is how can we help to overcome that, and what can we think about in order to improve that information flow and improve the opportunities for partnerships and collaborations. So some of the things in this plan that kind of specifically speak to that are things like the firefighting response plan, which tends to be a very regional and collaborative in nature. Also things like community education and participation programs. I think there's a lot of opportunities to leverage partnerships in that regard and go in on more regional programming to help add some economies of scale. Similarly, emergency management planning is more effective in coordination with neighboring communities. And I think the other one really is around water quality, particularly monitoring after the event of a storm event, to confirm that water quality has not been impacted, or to consider how to mitigate contamination due to debris in the event that there is a contamination event from a storm. And so these are some of the ways that we've been kind of thinking about how we might be able to start or tip the scale Gales to more partnerships and more collaboration. And we certainly welcome any conversations with people who have suggestions on how we could kind of really push that forward. As it's definitely, I think, for this particular community, still a work in progress.
Awesome, thanks. And that question comes from Katie Peterson, who's with the GOA adaptation team. So glad to see that lens from her team as well. Yeah, I would just maybe add, like, the completion of this work perhaps could also be a way of opening a relationship. So even just like saying, hey, we've done this, I think you could kind of benefit from reading through it, and perhaps your climate risks are similar to ours. If it's not a formal collaboration moving forward, perhaps just the opportunity to say hello is valuable. I'm not seeing any more questions, and we're a little bit over time, so maybe we'll actually just wrap up the webinar. If you do have further questions, please feel free to get in touch either with myself or Andrea and our team. I can pass along any questions to Claire, but she also did share her email, so feel free to reach out there. Just wanted to thank you for joining today. We appreciate the attendance for our webinars. I hope to see attendance down the line for future sessions as well. And then a last thank you to Claire for joining today as our sort of special guest talking about the project with Ghost Lake.
Thanks
Awesome.
so much, everyone, for joining us. And yeah, thank you to Claire for sharing your expertise here with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure as always.
Right. Thank you. Take care, everyone.